It used to be a simple story, at least in the eyes of the West Africa, was the endless supplier, the silent warehouse of raw materials that kept European factories running and American tech advancing. Oil, gold, uranium, lithium, coffee, cocoa, each shipment left African soil cheap and raw only to return as refined luxury goods sold back at a markup. For decades, this imbalance was accepted as if it were natural law. But what if that law has just been broken? Today, the winds have shifted. One by one, African nations are no longer shipping out their wealth without conditions. Ghana is holding back its gold. Uganda is roasting its coffee before it ever leaves port. Niger has told France its uranium is no longer for sale on the cheap, and Namibia is daring the electric car giants of the West to meet Africa on African terms. 10 nations and counting have stepped into a new era of economic control, where sovereignty is measured not just by flags and borders, but by who truly benefits from the land's riches. This is more than policy. It is a turning point, an economic revolution clothed in dignity. For the first time in generations, it is not Africa scrambling to catch up. It is the West that feels the squeeze, forced to reckon with its own hidden dependence. And that raises the question that the world can no longer ignore: is the West more reliant on Africa than it's ever been willing to admit? As we unpack this story, think of what it means not only for global markets but for the very idea of freedom and fairness. Do you believe this bold African stand will last, or will outside powers eventually push back? Please share your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe Africa's story deserves to be told on its own terms, hit subscribe and join us. The truth should speak louder than the headlines. When we talk about the event, it's not one isolated decision. It's a wave, a coordinated chorus of nations across Africa rewriting the rules of trade. For decades, Western economies quietly assumed that the continent's resources would flow endlessly raw and cheap to fuel their prosperity. But that assumption has shattered. 10 African countries stretching from west to east, from the Sahel to the southern coast, are now saying no more. At the center of this wave is Ghana. Long known as one of the world's top gold producers, Ghana has watched for generations as its mines were stripped of raw bullion, shipped abroad, refined in distant cities, and sold back at prices that far exceeded what local miners ever saw. In response, Ghana passed a groundbreaking rule: mining companies must now sell 20% of all refined gold directly to the Bank of Ghana. This is not just about numbers on a balance sheet. It's about building a cushion of sovereignty, insulating the nation from the dollar and the euro currencies that have too often dictated its fate. With this one policy, Ghana is no longer just digging up gold. It is converting that wealth into a tool for independence. Uganda, a giant in coffee, has taken a similarly bold step. For years, Ugandan farmers carried the backbreaking labor of growing beans that ended up in European cafes and global supermarket chains. Yet the profits, the real wealth, were made thousands of miles away when those beans were roasted, packaged, and branded. In 2021, Uganda broke the cycle by banning the export of raw agricultural products like coffee and tea. Instead, it began building an industry of its own, roasting, grinding, and packaging coffee right at home. What may look like a trade regulation is in fact a declaration Uganda refuses to remain the field hand of the global coffee empire. Its farmers deserve more than survival, they deserve prosperity. Then there is Gabon, whose forests for decades fueled the luxury wood markets of Europe and Asia. For every polished table or paneled wall in Paris or Beijing, raw logs left Gabonese soil with almost no value added locally. In 2010, Gabon shocked the world by banning raw log exports entirely. It was a bold gamble, but it worked. The ban sparked new industries: carpentry, furniture, production, wood processing. Factories opened, jobs multiplied, and for once the profits began to circulate at home. Mozambique followed with its own timber restrictions in 2017, proving that the policy wasn't a fluke, but part of a continental awakening. Niger, meanwhile, has struck at one of Europe's most sensitive lifelines: uranium. France powers nearly 70% of its energy grid with nuclear power, much of it historically dependent on uranium dug from Nigerian soil. But the old arrangement was profoundly unequal. Uranium left cheap, Paris prospered, and Niger remained one of the poorest nations on Earth. With new restrictions in place, Niger has forced France to confront an uncomfortable truth: its famed energy independence was always an illusion. Suddenly, it is not Niamey panicking over prices, but Paris scrambling to secure its reactors. Guinea has also redrawn the line, but in food rather than minerals. Facing global food price spikes, Guinea banned the export of staples like rice, maize, and yams. For years, Guinean farms fed markets abroad while its own shelves ran bare. With the ban, Guinea delivered a message as basic as it was powerful: our people come first. No longer would it starve to feed the world's wealthier tables. And the story does not stop there. Namibia has clamped down on lithium, the mineral that powers electric vehicles and batteries. The Ivory Coast has begun limiting cocoa bean exports, insisting on building its own chocolate industry. The Democratic Republic of the Congo has restricted raw cobalt and copper, forcing global tech firms to face the costs of their dependence. Zimbabwe has banned the export of raw chrome, demanding smelting and processing be done within its borders. Taken together, these moves form a pattern too large to ignore. They are not random policies. They are a continental shift, a revolution in how Africa relates to the world economy. For the first time in modern history, the nations that sit on the richest deposits of gold, uranium, cocoa, lithium, and coffee are refusing to play the passive role of supplier. Instead, they are demanding to be partners, even leaders. This is the central event. It is Africa drawing a line in the sand. If you want our resources, you meet us on our terms. For the West, it is a rude awakening. For Africa, it is the beginning of something long overdue, an era of economic self-respect. Every great shift in history has its breaking point, the moment when the world realizes the old rules no longer apply. For Africa's new resource revolution, that breaking point came with uranium. For decades, France prided itself on being energy independent. Nearly 70% of its power grid runs on nuclear energy, and the lifeblood of that system is uranium. But where does most of that uranium come from? From Niger, one of the poorest countries in the world. The deal was painfully lopsided. Paris enjoyed cheap and steady uranium, while Niamey struggled with poverty, corruption, and underdevelopment. Then came the wake-up call. After a major political shakeup, Niger announced restrictions on uranium exports, signaling that the old arrangement was dead. Overnight, France's so-called independence looked fragile, even illusory. Its reactors suddenly seemed chained to the Sahel. What was once invisible dependence was now a glaring vulnerability. This was the emotional peak, the moment when Europe's confidence cracked. If Africa could flip uranium into a weapon of sovereignty, what else could it do? France's panic became a global symbol of the West's hidden reliance on African soil. But Niger was not alone. Ghana's gold policies struck at another nerve. For years, Western banks and jewelry corporations had grown fat on Ghana's bullion refined abroad and sold at inflated prices. But now, 20% of refined gold must stay in Ghana's central bank. Suddenly, the flow of cheap reserves that had propped up foreign currencies began to dry. Markets felt the tremor. For the first time, Western traders understood that African nations were not bluffing. Uganda's coffee revolution carried the same drama, but in everyday terms. Imagine the shock of global coffee chains long used to buying raw beans for pennies, discovering that they now had to pay for roasted packaged Ugandan coffee or lose access entirely. For Starbucks, Nestlé, and countless other players, the model of squeezing profits from African farmers was disrupted overnight. What looked like a local agricultural reform turned into a jolt to the global coffee supply chain. The cascade continued. Ivory Coast's cocoa restrictions shook the chocolate industry to its core. Western companies that had long treated Ivorian beans as their birthright were suddenly confronted with the reality that they would either have to build factories in Abidjan or pay much higher prices. For consumers in Europe and the United States, that means one thing: chocolate just got more expensive. And then came lithium, Namibia's ace card in the global energy transition. As electric cars became the obsession of Western automakers, lithium became the new oil. But Namibia declared no more raw exports without local investment. That one sentence sent a ripple of panic through Silicon Valley and Detroit alike. Suddenly, the dream of a clean energy future seemed to run straight through African borders. The reaction across the West has been telling. Companies complain of higher costs, shrinking margins, and the risk of disrupted supply chains. Politicians warn of instability, and nationalist policies thinly veiled language that reveals their discomfort at losing control. Media outlets once silent on Africa's role now splash headlines about resource nationalism and the threat to global markets. Yet from Africa's perspective, this is not chaos. It is justice. For too long, nations rich in gold, coffee, uranium, and cocoa watched as their people remained poor while foreign corporations grew wealthy. Now the tables are turning. The climax is not only in the policies themselves, but in the pride they inspire. Across villages, cities, and parliaments, ordinary citizens are seeing their leaders draw red lines, and they are responding with a sense of dignity long denied. Internationally, the shock is spreading. Some Western allies quietly scramble to negotiate new terms, while others threaten to pull investments. But one truth can no longer be hidden: the age of cheap African resources is ending. The climax of this story is not in a single country's move, but in the collective realization that Africa is no longer asking for permission, it is setting the terms. This is the turning point. The moment when Africa's quiet defiance becomes impossible to ignore, and the West for the first time in generations must learn to adapt. When a continent begins to change its relationship with the world, the first signs are felt not in stock exchanges or foreign capitals, but in the daily lives of its own people. The wave of export restrictions sweeping across Africa is no exception. Beneath the headlines about gold, uranium, coffee, and lithium lies a deeper story, the story of how ordinary citizens are beginning to reclaim dignity, opportunity, and pride. Take Uganda's farmers, for example. For generations, they grew coffee beans that filled Western cups while they themselves struggled to afford basic necessities. Now, as Uganda shifts to exporting roasted and packaged coffee, new factories are opening, local workers are being trained, and farmers are seeing a share of profits that once flowed only to Europe. The difference is not abstract. It is measured in school fees, paid hospital bills covered, and new roofs built on village homes. This is what sovereignty looks like when it touches the soil. In Ghana, the decision to channel refined gold into the central bank has given the population a new sense of security. It may not yet erase the hardships of inflation or debt, but it signals something greater: that the wealth of the nation is not just for outsiders, but for Ghanaians themselves. This has political consequences. Citizens who once viewed governments as powerless in the face of foreign banks now see leaders taking steps to assert independence. That shift builds trust, and trust is the most valuable currency any state can hold. The political ripple effects are equally powerful. Across Africa, these policies are reshaping how leaders are judged. It is no longer enough to talk about sovereignty in speeches. People now demand proof in action. Guinea's food export ban, for instance, may frustrate international traders, but for local families, it is a lifeline. Being able to find rice or yams at a fair price in the market changes how citizens view their government, not as a servant of global markets, but as a protector of its own people. This transformation also reshapes the social fabric. In Gabon and Mozambique, the growth of timber processing industries has created jobs for thousands of young people who might otherwise have been unemployed or driven to migrate. With work comes stability, and with stability comes a stronger sense of belonging to the nation. These are the building blocks of social peace. Politically, the consequences extend beyond borders. Other African governments are watching closely. When Niger confronted France over uranium, it didn't just disrupt the energy market, it sent a signal across the Sahel, and beyond. Foreign powers can be challenged, and national interests can prevail. This emboldens neighboring states to take their own steps, creating a domino effect that strengthens regional solidarity. Of course, such bold moves also carry risks. Some Western governments may retaliate with aid cuts, trade penalties, or diplomatic pressure. Yet here lies the paradox: the stronger the domestic benefits, the harder it becomes for African leaders to back down. Citizens who see tangible improvements in jobs, food availability, or financial security are unlikely to support a return to the old dependency. In fact, they may punish any politician who dares to reverse course. In short, the consequences of Africa's new trade posture are not confined to balance sheets. They are lived out in the hands of farmers holding their own branded coffee, in miners knowing their gold strengthens their nation's reserves, in families eating food that once would have been shipped abroad. Politically, these choices are redrawing the social contract, turning promises of sovereignty into reality. And once people taste that reality, it is difficult to imagine them giving it up. From Washington to Brussels, the ripple effects of Africa's new trade posture are impossible to ignore. For decades, policymakers in the West operated on a comfortable assumption: African resources would remain cheap, abundant, and unquestioned. Now that assumption has been shattered, and the shockwaves are rattling global boardrooms and government halls alike. In the United States, the concern is twofold. First, supply chains. American technology companies Apple, Tesla, Microsoft depend heavily on cobalt from the Democratic Republic of Congo, lithium from Namibia, and rare minerals scattered across the Sahel. These are the raw materials that power electric vehicles, smartphones, and solar panels. Restrictions on exports mean that U.S. firms must either invest locally under African terms or face skyrocketing costs. In an election year when inflation and energy transitions are hot-button issues, such supply shocks feel especially threatening. Second, there is the geopolitical dimension. Washington has long seen Africa through a lens of aid, military partnerships, and limited trade arrangements. But now African nations are asserting themselves not as clients, but as independent players. The U.S. finds itself caught between rhetoric about partnership and the reality that its corporations are losing privileged access. For a nation used to setting global terms, this role reversal is deeply unsettling. Europe's dilemma is even sharper. France's near-total reliance on Nigerian uranium is a symbol of a broader dependency. Germany, heavily invested in renewable technologies, requires steady access to African lithium and cobalt. Italy and Spain, reliant on African agricultural imports, now face rising costs as countries like Guinea and Ivory Coast prioritize domestic needs. European leaders who once touted Africa as a strategic partner are suddenly scrambling to secure what used to be taken for granted. Reactions in the West vary. Some call for urgent investment and genuine partnership with African nations, arguing that shared prosperity is the only sustainable path. Others speak of instability, a coded term that reveals unease at Africa's newfound leverage. Think tanks publish reports warning of resource nationalism, while media headlines frame Africa's moves as threats to global markets rather than steps toward justice. The narrative itself betrays a deep bias. When Western nations protect their industries, it is called strategy. When Africa does the same, it is labeled dangerous. Globally, other powers are watching closely. Russia and China see opportunity in this moment. Moscow has already deepened ties with Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, presenting itself as a friend who respects sovereignty. Beijing, long an investor in African infrastructure, is quick to align with the idea of local processing and value creation. For Washington and Brussels, this competition raises alarms if they fail to adapt. Africa's alliances may tilt decisively eastward. But perhaps the most profound global impact lies in symbolism. Africa's collective stance is forcing the world to confront an uncomfortable truth: the continent is not just a supplier. It is a player with leverage capable of shaping markets and policies beyond its borders. For the United States, this raises a deeper question. Can it shift from treating Africa as a resource base to treating it as an equal partner? For Europe, the question is even starker. Can it face its colonial past and accept that the age of extraction is over? What is clear is that this moment marks a turning point in global economics and politics. The U.S. and Europe may resist, adapt, or even retaliate, but they cannot ignore the fact that Africa is no longer waiting for permission. History rarely announces itself with fanfare. More often, it comes quietly disguised as a policy decision in Accra, a new trade law in Kampala, a ban on exports from Niamey. But when you step back, the pattern is unmistakable. Africa is no longer the silent supplier. It is becoming the stage where the global order is rewritten. The warning signs for the West are clear. If they continue to treat African nations as mere warehouses of raw materials, they risk not only losing access but losing credibility. Already, European industries are scrambling, American tech giants are adjusting, and markets worldwide are recalibrating to a new reality. The question is not whether Africa has the leverage; it clearly does. The question is whether the world is willing to respect it. For Africa itself, the opportunity is immense, but so are the risks. Building industries at home, processing resources locally, and securing food sovereignty require more than bold declarations. They demand infrastructure investment and, above all, unity. If nations fragment or if leaders are swayed by short-term deals that return to the old patterns, this historic momentum could be lost. But if they hold firm, what we are witnessing may be the birth of a new economic era, one where dignity and sovereignty outweigh dependency. And here lies the broader challenge for viewers in the United States, Europe, and beyond. Are we prepared to accept a world where Africa does not simply serve, but competes, negotiates, and leads? Are we ready to pay fair prices for the resources that have powered our lifestyles for generations, or will old habits of exploitation attempt to reassert themselves under new disguises? As this story unfolds, one figure stands out, President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, whose uncompromising vision of sovereignty has inspired many of these shifts. Yet the question remains, can we continue to trust President Traoré's reform strategies to hold, or will external pressure and internal challenges demand a new successor? The answer will shape not only Burkina Faso, but the entire African awakening. So I leave you with this. Do you believe Africa's stand is the dawn of lasting independence or a temporary rebellion against an old order that still has deep claws? Share your thoughts in the comments. Let your voice join this global conversation. If you feel you are among the first to witness and support this African awakening, please share this video. Subscribe if you believe that the truth is more important than the headlines. Because the world is watching and Africa is no longer waiting.